Okay, so welcome everyone to what will probably be one of our final, hopefully, RIC sessions for a little while at least. This session is meant to review a little bit about where we have been in the Reconciling in Christ journey over the last year, and to talk about the welcome statement that we have arrived at, and to let you know about the survey that you're going to be receiving tomorrow electronically, and then probably a little bit later in the week via mail. And then also to talk a little bit about if the survey is overwhelmingly positive, if it looks like the council is going to approve this, we're already really starting to think about how do we live into being a reconciling in Christ congregation, because our work doesn't end here. It really just begins here. So please jump in at any point with questions that you have. The whole point of this session is really to tie up any loose ends. And, we know people are sometimes at church, sometimes not at church, might have missed whole portions of things, sometimes are living in other parts of the country during parts of the year. So no, all questions are totally welcome here, and we will answer them as best we can. Maybe give other Reconciling in Christ core team members, can you give a little wave just so folks know who you are? Yeah, all these good folks can answer questions as well. So we thought we would jump in here by just showing the Reconciling in Christ webpage that Nicole Porath and Candy Nordine actually, and Lisa's been really helpful in putting it together. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Or no, it looks white right now because it's going. Sorry. All right, can you see the RIC resource page?
Yes.
Yeah, there it is.
Is it there?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, we're gonna kind of just walk you through some of the stuff that's here. Here is the welcome statement, and we'll get looking at that more specifically in a little while. But I wanted to start by taking you all the way down here. When we first started this process, we put together a list of frequently asked questions about becoming a Reconciling in Christ congregation. And these are all here with the answers in little snazzy drop-down format. So if you have any confusion about any of those things, those questions are still there and available to be answered. Bill, do you want to talk us through some of the resources on this side of the page?
Sure. This is going to be a little challenging because.
Or can you see or not?
I can. Let me. Do you want to start, and then I'm going to navigate over to that so I can bring that up on my computer too, and then that way.
Yeah.
Kind of
well, I'll start out by saying before we. So basically, we started last October with a survey that's going to look very similar to the survey that folks are going to get on Monday, tomorrow. And we used that survey to sort of gauge where the congregation was. It was a very positive response. Some people still wanted some more information or had concerns. And so one of the first things that the core team did was to go through an RIC training in November. And that was a 2-day long training. I think we learned a lot and grew a lot through doing that. And then we started to plan our education for the spring. And we also started to have some one-on-one conversations with members of the congregation. And so I'm going to let Bill tell you a little bit then about what we did in terms of our educational programming in the spring.
Yep. So we had a number of amazing speakers come into our church that hopefully everybody was able to have some attendance at. Austin Hartke and Emily Kegler did some really good conversations, and we had some community members as well as some, am I remembering correctly, a former Bethel or a previous Bethel? I can't remember. off the top of my head now. I apologize, but we had just a really nice presentation of people who are living. Yep, thank you. Living the kind of living through the experiences that we have. How can I say it? Just the difficulties with LGBTQ plus individuals and their incorporation into churches, their ability to integrate into churches, really spoke through their personal experiences, which was super powerful. And so having that, and it was a great question and answer process that we had there. And then I think the other ones that really stand out are like the tricky text presentations, and some other Bethel U educational places that allowed people a chance to ask questions and just to learn a little bit more about what does the Bible say about being welcoming.
Yes, and all of those things, if you click on these links, right, you can see Greg Walter's explanation for the tricky texts. Both of the Hartke and Kegler presentations are here to click on and available. Lenny Jensen was one person who came and just shared her personal story, and she was kind enough to make that story available to the congregation, so that's available. What?
Really powerful. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And then, Marcy, do you want to talk a little bit about the Jen Hatmaker podcast? Because I think that was really wonderful too.
Sure, I was just having some coffee service brought in for a moment there.
Oh yeah, coffee service is great. Low around here.
And before I say that, I'm just struck by how full our February was with education and speakers. You know, and the timing of that just, I mean, it was so perfect, and we didn't even know what was going to be coming a few weeks later. Yeah. I'm so thankful for our speakers and the education that we had in person together. So the Jen Hatmaker podcast I shared this summer, it's a conversation between Jen Hatmaker and her daughter, who was, you know, her mom is Jen is a very well-known Christian speaker and travels all over. And when her daughter looked her up, she said she's loving but not affirming of the LGBTQIA+ community. And it's just a really powerful conversation because her daughter didn't know that Jen and her husband were in conversation with their pastor going through those tricky texts and really coming to know that the Bible, you know, messages that they had been grown up learning about, like Greg explained, you know, the people who did the translations and what their agenda was and how they wanted to communicate the message and what the original writers would have said, and, you know, all these pieces, and really coming to terms with, you know, that they really needed to affirm the LGBTQ+ community. And her daughter didn't know that and was struggling with that on her own. And it's just a very powerful conversation and letting us know how important it is to connect with our children in our church and in our community, and how important this process is to being a welcoming place for our families.
Thank you. Then, yeah, so we did some checking in a little bit this summer. And then when we sort of rolled out the welcome statement, we did do a, let's see up here, I think it says, we did do a session where we talked a little bit about the choices that we made when crafting the welcome statement. And though certainly during this session today, you're more than welcome to ask questions. If you want a more like systematic going through of like all of the language from the welcome statement, you can click here, and it's just like, we just recorded the first 10 minutes of the session, so we go through it pretty quickly. So that's available. So then we also this fall did another session on a show called Queer Eye, which was, we had a great discussion about that and showed some clips about a pastor really who was out but hadn't really come into his identity as a gay man, and the ways in which sort of stepping into his identity further enriched the life of the whole congregation. And I think that that session and that show is a really good reminder to us of the ways in which we are all brought to a better place when every member of our congregation can be who they are meant to be fully inside the walls of our church and inside the world, obviously, but making our church a safe place for people to be who they are enriches all of us. It's not just about helping the other person, it's about helping ourselves too. Because yeah, anyway, and I think that that show does a marvelous job of sort of showing that relationship. All right, team, what am I missing in terms of other things that
Just want to
other
say,
important?
sure. I
Yeah.
just want to add in that throughout this whole process, we've been trying to be as open and as communication oriented as possible. And so there was a number of people that expressed interest in hearing more. And so we did a lot of work really about trying to reach out to people and answer questions and address concerns. And I can't remember, I don't think you mentioned it, but just like with the circle meetings, the coffee hours that we were available at, and just people that expressed interest in wanting to hear or have further discussion. I think it's fair to say we did a fair amount of that kind of outreach as well.
Yes. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Other core team members, like important moments kind of along the way or things that I've sort of brushed over here?
I think I'll just piggyback on what Bill said. You know, early on, we had a table set up in the narthex every Sunday and every Wednesday for a while there, you know, with a question box and asking people to give their input and tell us what they needed to hear from us. And I think we did everything we could when we were still able to meet together in person to be available to people.
And even afterwards, I mean, there was a fair amount of reach out afterwards too, which was nice. Post-pandemic.
That's right. Any questions from other folks about what we've done, or just kind of lingering questions that you have about any of this? Anybody want to jump in? We can stop the share here so we can see each other better.
This is Krista, and I just have a quick question about some of the feedback that you've been getting. Could you characterize the feedback? Has it been overwhelmingly positive? Have we had some really difficult questions that we've had to answer? Since I haven't really been involved since the beginning, it would be helpful just to have you encapsulate that a bit.
Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, I could start. I think we were very, I wouldn't say surprised. I think we were just really happy to find last fall when we started with the original survey that most of the responses were overwhelmingly positive. And I think that's been true of most of the events that we have held. And one comment that I've heard a few different times from people that I think was very heartening is people said, I thought we were RIC. I had no idea that we weren't. And so maybe one thing that's maybe in the background of all of our minds is that we haven't really heard very many negatives or people who are concerned about this. And so you always kind of wonder, you know, who's out there maybe with a different point of view that we're not hearing from because maybe they don't feel like they're able to express that because it has been so positive.
I just want to add to that I received, so we were all kind of divvied up like people that had questions, and we each took some people to reach, especially at the beginning. And I wasn't sure what to expect when I reached out to people just to answer questions or to have conversation with them. But what I found, just like what Pam was mentioning, is that it wasn't concern. It was really about affirmation of the process and telling personal stories and personal experiences with their own welcoming. And so what, not so much them being welcomed as a LGBTQ plus person, but just having family members or just being aware of this need in the community. And I think just like what Pam was saying is that this seemed to be a nice doorway for people to be able to finally be able to have a platform to say, thank goodness, and here's why I think this is so important, rather than why on earth are we doing this? It was overwhelmingly supportive from my experience.
that was really true also in the one-on-ones that I did. I would say the great majority of those that I talked to on the phone or in face-to-face were supportive of the process. It was a time of people sharing their stories and their family members' stories, which was very interesting. And so they, because of their own connection, their own journey within their own families, were very supportive that we were moving in this direction and taking the time to, and greatly appreciated that they were called. And one of the things I want to do now is follow up with those people and remind them the survey is coming, and please respond if you have not responded already. So I kind of kept track of those people, but I had only maybe one or two persons who had questions. Maybe I wouldn't say they were not supportive of it, but really needed to have some other resources. So what I did basically is refer them to the website, and hopefully we'll follow up now, find out if they did go to the website, because there are a lot of different opportunities to learn more and to have some of the questions answered. So I think overall very positive.
Last fall and early winter, when we had the tables set up outside in the narthex, outside the sanctuary, to take questions, there were people who came to the table, a bit like as what Pam said, who said, we're visiting and we want to be at this church. We thought you were an RIC church, and if you weren't in the process of becoming one, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't stay here. And I also, oh, go ahead, Anton, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, that's heartening, because as some of you were in a group that I joined last or earlier this month, I can't remember when, but we tried this 20 years ago and it failed. And part of the thing I also remember at the time was threats from both sides. You know, if you do this, we'll leave. If you don't do this, we'll leave. We did lose several members when we didn't vote. And it was painful for the congregation to go through. I don't know if there were a lot, but I at least know one family unit said, and it was somebody who contributed heavily to the congregation, and that was used as a sort of, if you do this. So I'm glad to hear we're not hearing those sorts of things now. I really am.
I think there were some people who their hesitancy about us going through this process had to do with that history, Anton. And so there was a lot of conversations we had to have sort of around that it wasn't about the issue itself, but about people being worried about the congregation getting fractured again. And I think also to answer your question, Krista, like it's not that we got zero negative responses. We did get a couple to the initial survey. But what we learned from going through the Reconciling in Christ training is that in any congregation, you're always going to have a spread of people. And in some ways that, like in a healthy congregation, you do want like a range of different, not necessarily ideas about this particular issue, but obviously like we love there to be different kinds of diversity at Bethel. But that the RIC process was never about moving people who were like adamant no's to saying yes, because they just were like, that's probably not going to happen. It was about finding the people who are like leaning yes, or who are saying like, yes, but I need more information, and focusing almost all of the education and opportunities and conversations on those folks, which didn't mean that you wouldn't have. So I would say a lot of the people that were like hard, fast, no folks did not seek us out to have conversations about it. Like, I think that we would have had those conversations, but I think probably we knew and they knew that like that's maybe not, that having that conversation was not going to change where they were. And that we had to kind of say, that's okay. Like that we are not going to be able to be at 100% at our congregation, and that's okay. But I think trying to gauge the success of the education have we met all of the folks who were kind of in the middle and leaning towards it, but didn't feel like they could say yes fully because they were worried about the past history at Bethel, or because they weren't sure about the scriptural things, all of that kind of stuff that we hope. Do you feel like your question got answered, Krista? Is that?
I do. Yes. Thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah, it was a great question. Anybody else have questions?
I just want to applaud you all for bringing in the folks that you did. Not just bring people from outside of a faith tradition who were attacking the church, but people who were part of that situation, people who live in this community. Emmy Kegler was a student of mine, and I knew she was going through some of these questions. She wasn't as candid about some of the stuff, but to see how she has grown as a human being, to see how she's grown as a woman of faith, to bring Austin, who's been part of one of our sister congregations, and how that all played out. I think that also made, it's always easy to point a finger and say, well, it's those people, but it's when folks are in our midst and they're part of our community. And no, these are not devils with horns. These are loving human beings. And now, can you just, as I said in the last thing, if we're truly followers of Jesus Christ, God's love is not conditional. And that's the ultimate end to me, that we have to finally accept that we're sinful, but we have our own issues, each of us in our own way. But that death and resurrection, if you really believe in that, God has forgiven us. So can we forgive each other, and can we just not make God's love conditional to be part of this family?
In September, we had a little circle chat outside at Bethel for people who wanted to come. And I wonder, Clark, if we have at least one member of the call committee sitting here with us. And I'm wondering, Clark, if you would be willing to share your thoughts about what you said about at that little circle chat about clergy considering a call.
Oh, I think the question was raised by one of the persons that was at that circle chat. Was what if we call a person who doesn't favor congregation being RIC? Is that the question you're asking about, Paula?
Yes, yes.
And I guess what I said, don't remember exactly how I said it, but it was, I believe that if that was the stance of a particular candidate, we probably would not call that person, because they're coming into a situation where it's already been affirmed, and that would really be counterproductive. I think that would really be counterproductive. And I am a believer that there are wonderful candidates out there who would be in support of where this is going in Bethel. Now, I know there are, without trying to name names, etc. But there are people who would be excited about the possibility of being in a congregation where that decision has been made, and we are trying to live into that, as Kate has suggested, as a congregation. So that's basically.
So in a way, we're more attractive to candidates by having done the work of RIC.
And candidates would be more attracted to us,
yes,
as well.
Well, I don't see how we could call someone. I mean, the pastor is a shepherd. If the flock is headed one way and the shepherd's heading the other way, we're going to have chaos. That's just common sense.
Yeah, no.
And to have somebody, and some of us who've been around for a while, we've had at least one associate who was not keen on this thing and said so from the pulpit. And I remember it wasn't Pastor Tim. I said, if that comes out again, I will leave this church. It was after the division. We didn't need any more division. We needed more healing. So I would hope, that to me is just common sense. You're not going to bring someone in here who can't be welcomed. Pastor has a hard enough job already to deal with. We really are sheep when we go all our ways. You need someone who's going to be able to gather us together.
Well, maybe I will pop up the just welcome statement, the final survey that you're going to get in the mail. And there'll be a link. You're going to get an email tomorrow that will also have a link to this same thing. But that way, if anybody has any questions about the survey or the welcome statement, and this might, we don't have to linger here too long, but so this is what it should look like. We're asking people to return it by November 1st. Would somebody be willing to read the welcome statement just so we can hear it? I think it's good to hear it. I'm excited about it.
I can read it. Bethel Lutheran Church shares Christ's love with a big heart. We celebrate all people as children of God. We unconditionally welcome diversity of age, race, citizenship, ethnicity, cultural identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, education, relationship status, family structure, and life challenges. Your diversity and uniqueness are valued. Your questions and your doubts have a home here. You, your spouse, partner, children, family, and friends, welcome to be full participants in the life of our church. Welcome.
Any questions about this statement? Or,
you know, I think it's important to point out that, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, and again, I'm not trying to do editing by committee when I suggest this. The only thing that jumps out at me, because it also identifies with part of our community here, is socioeconomic. You know, the reason we have, you know, food assistance in the towns that we like to think Northfield is all, but we have people who are homeless. We have people who are struggling. And I'm seeing this even among my students at St. Olaf, who you think, okay, if they're at St. Olaf, they've either had the means or they have through the college been given the means to do this. And there are still kids who can't do everything, you know, don't have everything. So that's the only thing that I see just maybe missing. And again, recognizing we're not at all at the same, certainly the same economic level, but even some of our backgrounds that lead us into that. Part of the socio can be coming under race and ethnicity and cultural identity. But the economic thing is a big thing when you're talking about marginalized people.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Does one of the core members want to speak to that? Because we did have economic status in there and we took it out and put in life challenges, I believe, correct,
Yes.
Bill?
Yes.
That's right.
Somebody want to speak to why we did that?
We had written, I think we had written economic reality.
Mm-hmm.
Something, I think that's exactly what we had written. And that jumped out, I think, to some of the council members, as I recall. And then we decided that there were many ways to have challenges, economic being one of them. So we generalized that language, is what I'm remembering. Others might have more to say.
I'm just wondering, and that helps, Paul, to know that when you say life challenges, that fits. And I don't know somewhere else in the document or something, but if you're going through that type of situation, and that because I think there are a lot of reasons why people either could gravitate to community or feel like they're not welcome in a community. And you know, we don't see folks at Bethel who look like they might be hungry, or we don't see folks. I mean, and I say that in relationship to when I'm often in New York, not my home congregation, I'm talking about when I'm in Manhattan, often doing some of these weekend gigs while you don't see me in church some weekends. But I go into there's a couple Lutheran churches I attend that are right in the middle of the theater district. And it's very clear, folks are economically challenged. You know, they come as they are, just as I am without one plea, they come. But we don't see that, and I think that can be at times a blindness. So, and I don't know if somewhere in the document, or if you don't want to leave it in, because I think you're right, it's an efficient way to say life challenges. But if somewhere in the document that could be explained, because that was the one thing that popped out at me. Challenges didn't necessarily equate that we're talking about economic stress.
Right. It's not very specific. Mhm.
I think the other concern, and I'm trying to remember the specific conversation, and my memory has faded a little bit about that, but I think the risk is if we try to call out every issue, there's a greater chance that we'll forget or miss something, and we don't want anyone to feel left out or marginalized by like an inconclusive list. So I think that was another part of this too. But your point
And I
is well.
think that there was like, because we started, I think, with the phrase economic status. And then that didn't feel right. And then what was the other phrase we went to, Paula? You mentioned
I
it.
think it was economic reality.
And then economic reality felt like we were really into like word by word details. And then economic reality felt a little bit wishy-washy and strange. And I think the word like economic status, like just putting the word status in there felt yucky to us too, because status contains a kind of judgment in it.
Apologize for this noise. I don't know how to stop it in the background. It'll end soon. Sorry.
You could mute yours, Paula.
Sorry. I'm having trouble. Oh, I'm having trouble.
If you mute your.
Okay. Oh, it didn't do it?
There you go. Anton, can you think of, because I do think it was definitely like an important thing that we discussed, and everything that you say about our community, and especially in the time of COVID, right, where people are really feeling it. Yeah. We want to make that clear. Does anybody have ideas for?
How about just saying, and economic and other life challenges? Just add economic and other life challenges.
See,
I don't want to be a wet blanket, but I'm not sure at this point we can change it without the council's approval. And we're sending the survey out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. So
well, as a council member, I don't think there'll be any objections to that, but.
I think one thing that we had also considered is where we have the welcome statement, to whether that's in a brochure or something. Like, one of the ideas that we had is, because there's a lot of rationale that goes into this, is to perhaps have another place in our church where we explain the purpose of this, or that was another kind of like the annotated version of this. And so I wonder if that might be a really good place to have some of this, because clearly we won't be able to get to every single thing in this really concise statement, but we wanted it to be very clear that really there are no barriers to being a member of our church, and so these are really good points. And I wonder if
Bill, that's what I think I'm talking about. If you don't want to, I like Nicole's suggestion, but I understand what you're saying, and I would even say that you might want to consider bringing that back before this final thing goes totally online, if we couldn't do that, because if it jumped out of my dumb musician's brain, it's going to jump out a lot of other people's brains.
Absolutely.
But I agree with you, because when you do mission statements, or in this case a welcome statement, there's normally, you want as concise a statement as possible, but then you normally have somewhere in a document or something you clarify, and I think that could be a point of clarification.
Yes,
I think that's a really good segue into talking a bit about the statement and where we go from here. What do you think, Kata?
Yeah, let me just show so people will have this, and then the entire survey is just one question. So we're hoping that it's pretty easy for folks to fill out. But yes, I think that is a great segue in terms of talking about where to go from here. And I think that one thing, I'll just start us out, because this came out in our previous discussion, and I've pitched it. I haven't heard back from Brian. I sort of pitched it to Brian too, that the living into this welcome statement. Yes, the welcome statement includes sexual orientation and gender identity, and that's been the part that's about the RIC process. But this welcome statement contains race and citizenship and life challenges, which includes economics and stuff too. And so that it's possible that moving forward, the group that's figuring out how to live into the sexual orientation and gender identity part might also be part of it might be a larger group that really thinks about, okay, how are we going to live into all of the words of this welcome statement in an authentic way? Because there's ways we are not living into other parts of this welcome statement too. And so, but maybe that's too big of a task. I don't know. Maybe we need like one big committee that has smaller subcommittees that's going to think about it. But I think, you know, like, I think race, you know, really, we really need to have that discussion too. And I know it's already being had in certain ways in our congregation, but in terms of how we live into it, how do we put these conversations into the curriculum that we're talking about with our kids? How do we put it into liturgy? How do we put it into the spaces that we walk into? I think we'd love feedback, both on like, where do you want to see this and feel this lived out in Bethel? Like, where are the places? Where is it most important to you to feel this? This welcome? And also just in terms of process, you know, how do you see it playing out? Like, that would be great to hear about too. Yeah. Other core members, you want to jump in? And
I think that this statement really goes into the hands of every single committee, every single organization, every aspect. There's no aspect of the congregation that shouldn't be touched by this and be challenged as you look at mission, programming, all of those kinds of things. This is really a guide and a challenge to where are we living this out? Where are we not living this out? I'm thinking from the standpoint of working with mission and justice, for example. There's any number of facets for that task force to be looking at this statement under the microscope, so to speak.
Wasn't that the feedback that we received from people, is that words are great, but also they're looking for tangible evidence of where does this impact my participation in this church? Yeah, and yeah. So like just what you said, Kate, I'm not going to reiterate it, but I think that's exactly right, Clark, is that people are going to look at what are we doing about it? The words are nice, but what are we doing about it?
I think it's important to note that becoming an RIC congregation is really just as simple as having a welcome statement. That's basically all you have to do. And it would be very easy to put it on the shelf and say, yep, we did that, and check it off the list. And I think our core team is really committed, as others have said, to making sure that it doesn't just sit on the shelf. And I think it was Clark, but maybe somebody else talked about this in one of our meetings, that, you know, when we have adopted this welcome statement, we want to make sure that it's a part of the new member class, that, you know, it's focused on, and people, when they join Bethel, understand that this is a really important part of who we are. It's not just a nice rainbow flag out in the parking lot. It's not just a little logo that we have on the church sign out front, that we are really doing something about it. And so we do have great hopes that there will be a group of people or several groups of people who will be constantly putting this in front of us and figuring out how are we living out this statement.
Mm-hmm. I would say you're exactly right on. I mean, I sit on a couple national boards, and what we're looking at is great, again, to have great language, but where's the action? Mm-hmm. And action is what's being, and I'm going to tell you, just finished reading an article yesterday, or it was early this morning, I guess. When you start looking at the difference between baby boomers, millennials, and Generation Z, or whatever this youngest generation is. And we baby boomers live by language, yeah. And we can be, but millennials and younger, they want to see action. They want to see it lived out. So I think that every aspect of this is coming in our Sunday school curriculum, in our confirmation, because that's especially when a lot of these issues are being hit. And when kids are finally, they have their own minds at that point. As I related to some of you, I nearly lost one kid as a confirmation mentee, because 3 weeks before the confirmation, he was having real problems with issues of gender and how the church deals with women and with LGBTQ. These are things that have to be grappled with, and they see it a lot differently than we do, than those of us over a certain age. And so I think if Bethel, one of the things I told you why I joined that congregation 31 years ago was because when I experienced it, it felt like it was welcoming. And it wasn't like Katie just said, it wasn't just word. I saw it in the liturgy. I heard it in the prayers, the hymns that were sung, okay? That people actually did turn around and greet me. You know, I've been in churches as recently as 10 years ago in a different part of the country when I was ignored, and I was clearly the person who looked different in that congregation, and nobody talked to me on a Palm Sunday until the director of music actually got up, introduced me, and then all of a sudden, oh, they gave me a status. I mean, that was action that was so clear to me. Nobody talked to me. So one woman turning around, oh, you have a lovely voice. Maybe you want to think about joining our choir, you know? But that was action. Even to the point when I asked for a bulletin, because it was a Palm Sunday service, they started outside and they said, oh, you're going to join us? Real life, okay? Texas, but real life. But we're I think the actions that we do, so I think this is, and what Clark said, it can't just be a committee. This has to permeate the life and the blood of this congregation.
In your surveying and talking to people, have you explored how open this congregation is to having an LGBT pastor?
Not directly, I don't think. I know that there's I'm on the call committee as well. I mean, there's a number of people that have expressed very powerful interest in saying this would be a great step for our congregation. But I don't know that that's a hiring criteria that anybody has really put out.
No, I just was wondering how open, because as we talk about putting it in use, that is the most obvious out front way of showing that we agree with this statement.
I think part of it is just like process wise, what Reconciling in Christ suggests is that, you know, you go through this process, you sort of do the vote, and then you kind of start to have these conversations that we're having, which is like the specific, like, how are we living into this? Yes. And I think that the tricky thing for our congregation is that they're sort of like happening simultaneously. Like in some ways it would be great if we were doing, and because of COVID, right? It's hard to have really like conversations where you really feel like tons of people are present and contributing. And so, I mean, I would be thrilled and over the moon. Like if we called an LGBTQIA pastor, I think that would be phenomenal and a great way. I mean, if the person was the right fit, right? Like, I mean, I think that would be a great way to live into this. But I think that we do have to like affirm the welcome statement, affirm that that's where we want to be. And then like Pam was saying, there's not specific things for each congregation of like being RIC means X, Y, like you have to do X, Y, or Z. I personally feel like, how can we authentically live into this if we're not open to calling an LGBTQIA pastor? Like, to me, those things feel pretty antithetical to me, but I'm pretty far, like, I realize also that I'm like, you know, that we're not all in the same place. And so I want to also, you know, push gently, but in a way that that we're all coming along together. And there's people who are further along than I am in terms of their own journey of this too. So,
May I just make a point to that? And I agree with you, Kata, but I also I'm going to go back into something that's right in our own community. St. Olaf is having its racial issues right now. All right. And one of the things, it's messy. And one reason it's messy is because the current president, when he was inaugurated, I was at that inauguration, he said, I don't want my legacy to be about bricks and mortars. I want it to be that this community, the St. Olaf community, looks much more like the world outside. So this was main agenda, and we've done it in terms of recruiting the students, It's been more pushed. Still a lot more has to be done in faculty and staff. But here's my point. It's fine to have that push, but the community still wasn't ready. Internally, we were not ready. And that's why we're having a bunch of mess up at that campus right now, because internally, we did not change enough minds to say, okay, we really want people who are different from what this place looks like. And some of us, and I'll say it my way, we knew how to assimilate and get through the pitfalls to the last 20 some odd years. And when that's not there for some of my colleagues, they're leaving. We're not retaining folks. So that's the only thing I want to say. That, yes, a very firm statement, but to be a, Clark, I'm going to tell you, to be a clergy, you live in a fishbowl enough, and your family lives in a fishbowl enough. And I wouldn't want to bring somebody in this community that this church and this church community was not really willing to accept and support. Because there's a hell of enough thing to be a pastor. And then to have that when you have half, I think part of it is that we have to really do that work so that this is truly welcoming, especially for the shepherd. That we're not asking somebody to deal with our crap that we haven't dealt with first.
Right. And that's why I think we would not want to automatically say like we're an RIC congregation and thus, of course, we are going to call it, you know what I mean? Like, I think we want to make sure that we're taking people on the journey that makes sense. Yeah. That was a great question, Linda. Did that answer it for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, are we going to be truly welcoming to those people who are not quite at that same place with us? You know, that's part of the tension I've seen in congregations where we've been before. You know, not everybody's going to be on the same page, but we have to also welcome those people who disagree with us a little bit, you know, who aren't quite ready to, you know, and that's a real hard place to be in. But I thank you, Antone, for your comments about pastors being in a fishbowl, because that's exactly right.
You know, I think Darlene, Reconciling in Works, when they came and did the workshop for us last fall, put it really well. And they said, there are going to be people who are not on board with this. There are going to be people who disagree with you. And you listen to them and you hear what they have to say, but you don't let them derail you. And so we can certainly allow people and welcome all people, but we don't allow them to derail us or to change our focus.
Yeah, and that's where each group of committees and Bible study groups, whatever, within the congregation are going to have to work out practically, you know, how do we do that?
I think Paula reminded me, well, and maybe Darlene, you were there too, in our women's Thursday morning book group. I don't have any recollection of what book we were talking about, but when it comes to disagreeing with somebody about whatever issue, you know that there are issues that people are not going to change their minds about. And one of the authors we read about talked about the phrase, I see that differently than you do. Don't try to change minds. Don't try to, you know, get in a big war of words. But, you know, when you recognize that you're up against somebody who's just never going to change their mind, and you don't be antagonistic about it, you just simply say, I see things differently than you do. And I think as a congregation, we can say to folks who disagree with this welcome statement, we at Bethel see things differently than you do, but you're still welcome to join us. We're not going to change our ways, but you're welcome to join us.
In my first year writing class, I teach a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it's written by a moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. And his whole thing, done lots of evidence-based, right, is that really the only time that we're going to change our minds is when we're in relationship with somebody who we're instinctually leaning towards in relationship, right? And so it's why congregations can actually be places of change if we begin from that place of welcome and love. If somebody sees us that, even if we have a different belief, and I feel this way about members of our congregation, and honestly, during this election season, I miss Bethel because when I'm at Bethel more than anywhere else in my day-to-day life, I know I'm around people that have different political views than I do, and I love them. and sometimes when I'm watching debates and I'm in the middle of election stuff, I don't, it's harder for me to love people who are on the other side. And so I think, Darlene, sort of to your point, like the real change can take place when we do welcome people who are different from us, and that we can be changed by them and they can be changed by us. So I think it's, yeah, to your point, it's especially important that we continue to welcome folks that aren't in the exact same place that we are, because I think that's where the amazing, gospel of Jesus that Anton was mentioning, the unconditional love, that's the place where we get to share it, right? In an honest way that's life-changing. So it's opportunity and grace too, I think. I'm also cognizant of the fact that we are coming up on an hour of time, and I don't want to keep anyone too long.
Katie, to that last point, though, I do worry. As I said, some of us have been around who did not leave the church 20 years ago. And I don't want, as for the very reasons you just stated, there are good people who may differ from us on this. And so I think part of this is, and I agree with Pam, bring them, and we're not going to change. But how do we keep people in the boat so that we don't lose them, and that we don't, because this has also been for many of those folks, this has been their church home for years and years. And at a time in their lives when they don't need to be trying to go out and find a new home or feel like they've been displaced. How do we, and I think that's the other side of it. It's not just, we'll forget you, or, if you don't, leave. But how do we bring that in? And because I think those are honest feelings that have to be understood and respected. But also, I think, to lay out a claim why we see this is following, God's call to us, and help them to share, because theirs is also a strong faith. So I think you have a good point, because that is, I hope people won't just pull away if they don't get their will. Some of us did not pull away 20 years ago, even though it was very hurtful for us. And we stayed, and I think, till 20 years, but we're seeing some differences. So.
And I will reaffirm too, like I had a little conversation with Noel Stratmon about this, and 20 years ago, he was getting a lot of vitriol and notes and phone calls, and it was pretty crazy. And I've been pretty good touch with Pastor Tim and other folks, and this is not a situation where people are calling all the time and being like, no, this is terrible. So, I don't feel like there's a strong sense of folks who are vehemently, verbally, really saying I'm going to leave if this happens. Like we haven't, as far as we know.
There's been a huge cultural shift since then, I think, is what you're saying. Yeah. One concern that I have is just because I was saying this to the group when we were beginning, I think it's really important that we bring as many responses to this survey as possible to the council. And I know that our inboxes are flooded right now. I am losing emails all the time. And so I have a concern that we don't get enough responses to this survey, the kind of response we just want to overwhelmingly say, like, look at how many people we heard from, look at this response. And so one thing I would ask of you to prayerfully consider, if this feels comfortable to you, is to just reach out to 4 or 5 people and just say, hey, did you like shoot them an email, send them a text, give them a phone call? Hey, did you respond to that survey? And you don't, like no pressure to respond one way or the other. It's just the get out the vote, like just because there's so much going on right now. And so if you have, if when you get the survey and respond to it, you have time to just send off an email to 3, 4, 5 people in the congregation and just say like, hey, we really got to respond to this. That would be great. Other final thoughts from anybody, core team members, lovely participants?
Is this statement going to still be up for revision at all, or are you at the end of the process?
Well, I think we're at the end of the process in the sense that I think this is what's going to get voted on. We don't have time to change that. It's going out tomorrow. I think if we were to change any language from here on out, that would really be a process that the council would probably have to go through and think about. We really did, like we started this process in June, and it's gotten complicated with COVID, but we have allowed for chances to respond to that and stuff. So I think, I think adding economics, adding something like that wouldn't be a tremendous deal, but it would really need to be considered and considered thoughtfully. And I don't think that it's in our purview as the RIC team to do that part anymore right now. Does that make sense?
I think the survey really is more to get a sense of, are people supportive of including this kind of a welcome at Bethel? And so I do think down the road, the council certainly has the power to change a word here or there if they choose to. I think the survey is really more about showing that the congregation is behind including people regardless of anything. There's no, what's the word I'm looking for? There's just no restrictions on who we are going to welcome. And as long as that's the intent, I do think down the road, the council has the authority to make changes in the wording if they choose to.
Any other questions, comments?
I just think that the whole process is meant to be life affirming, and within our families, in the congregation, in the community. I think it's life affirming, and that's my personal goal or hope, and going through this process is to affirm life and all of its diversity, etc. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing, and we need to see that it's a hopeful thing. And in the midst of all that's going on, we definitely need evidence of hope in the lives of people.
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. It's a great place to end, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's a great statement. Thank you so much for having this session this morning. I just wanted to say, I like the entire statement, but I think the thing that I love the most about it is where it says your questions and your doubts have a home here. So kudos to you all for being really upfront and acknowledging that. I think oftentimes religion is used as the answer, as opposed to having a church, a community of faith where you can really grapple with the difficult issues that we've been talking about. And to me, that phrase, it just says a lot about what kind of congregation we want to be.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for this journey. I'm grateful for all of you coming and being present this morning. And I'm grateful, as Krista just said, that we are a congregation and a people who are able to meet each other in the messy middle of things and be present to each other with grace and compassion, and seeing each other as our whole human selves in the middle of it. So thank you for being those people and being that congregation that feels like home. And I hope that you will vote on the survey when you receive it and pass the word along to others as well.